you're lying on cold stone. Your breath comes in shallow gasps. Above you, faces blur, some familiar, some not. The pain is everywhere now, radiating from places you didn't know could hurt. And somewhere in the fog of agony, you realize this is not the end they planned for you. This is something they designed to be worse. You were supposed to break. You were supposed to beg. You were supposed to disappear into history as a warning. But you didn't. You survived. And that survival, that refusal to die when death would have been mercy, came its own form of terror. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's honestly incredible how a story buried in medieval archives can reach someone halfway across the world right now. This is not about queens who died heroically. History has plenty of those martyrs, their stories polished into legend. This is about the ones who lived, who endured things so brutal that execution would have been a kindness. Women who walked out of torture chambers, who outlasted their tormentors, who carried scars that never fully healed but refused to let those scars define their end. These 7 women didn't just survive. They forced history to remember that survival itself can be an act of defiance. And what they endured reveals something darker than any execution: the human capacity to inflict suffering that never quite kills, but never quite ends. The first name you need to know is Inés de Castro, though. When we meet her, she's not a queen yet. That title comes later, and under circumstances so grotesque they still feel impossible. Portugal, Isen Sidling S., Inés arrives as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Constanza, and immediately catches the attention of Prince Pedro, Constance's husband. What begins as an affair becomes something more dangerous. Genuine love in a world where royal marriages are political contracts, not romantic partnerships. When Constanza dies in childbirth, Pedro doesn't even pretend to mourn appropriately. He moves Inés into the palace. He has children with her. He refuses every marriage proposal his father, King Afonso IV, arranges. And here's where the nightmare begins. Not because of what Inés does, but because of what she represents. A woman with no royal blood, no political alliance, no strategic value, holding the heart of the future king. To Afonso and his advisors, she's not a person, she's a contamination. On January 7th, 1355, while Pedro is away hunting hand, that detail matters. The careful timing, the premeditation 3 of the king's men arrive at the monastery where Inés lives with her children. She knows immediately what this is. There's no trial, no formal accusation. They drag her outside. Contemporary accounts, written by monks who witnessed it, describe her begging not for her own life, but for her children to be cared for. One assassin reportedly hesitated. The other 2 did not. They slit her throat in the monastery courtyard while her children watched from a window. Pedro learns of her murder the same day, and this is where survival becomes its own form of horror, because Inés doesn't survive. But what happens to her body after death reveals how far a man will go to force the world to acknowledge what it tried to erase. 2 years later, Pedro becomes king. His first act is hunting down the 3 assassins. He captures 2 of them, the 3rd fled to Castile. What Pedro does next was recorded in such disturbing detail by royal chroniclers that modern historians initially thought it was exaggeration. He has them brought to the palace courtyard. He personally rips out their hearts, one through the chest, one through the back while they're still alive. Then he makes every nobleman in the court watch as the bodies are displayed for 3 days. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what he does with Inés. Pedro has her body exhumed from its grave. He has her remains dressed in royal robes, a crown placed on her skull. Then he forces every member of the Portuguese nobility, bishops, dukes, advisors who stood silent while she died, to approach her corpse and kiss her decomposing hand, swearing fealty to her as their rightful queen. The ceremony lasts hours. Men who'd called her a concubine are now required to bow to her remains. It's medieval psychological warfare, a king forcing his court to honor in death what they'd destroyed in life. Inés de Castro becomes the only woman in European history crowned queen after death, not as an honor, but as an act of vengeance that doubles as grief. But Inés is dead, even if her coronation came posthumously. The women we're focusing on didn't have that escape. They had to keep living. Caterina Sforza learned early that being captured was not the end. It was the beginning of a very specific kind of hell designed for women who refused to submit. Italy, 1499. Caterina is the Countess of Forec, a fortress city she's defended for years through siege, assassination attempts, and political betrayal. She's not playing at war, she's commanding troops, designing fortifications, executing strategy that keeps professional generals awake at night. Then Cesare Borgia arrives with an army she can't match. After weeks of bombardment, her fortress falls. She's taken prisoner. And Borgeson of a pope, military genius, and by all accounts, a man who understood exactly how to break people, doesn't execute her. That would be too simple, too quick. He has something else in mind. The records from this period are fragmentary, intentionally destroyed by the Borgia family. But what survives comes from Caterina's own later testimony and letters from Venetian ambassadors who documented everything they heard. Borgia imprisons her in Rome's Castel Sant'Angelica, same fortress where prisoners disappeared regularly. For months, she's held in a cell barely large enough to stand. The torture is systematic. Sexual assault is used as a weapon of humiliation. Her captors make sure she knows. This is what happens to women who think they can command armies. This is what happens when you forget your place. But here's what breaks the narrative. Borgia wanted to create Caterina doesn't break. After 18 months, she's released through a negotiated prisoner exchange. She's physically destroyed, bearing injuries that leave her unable to have more children. She's financially ruined, stripped of her titles and lands. By every political measure, she's been erased, except she hasn't. She returns to Florence, remarries, and spends the next decade quietly rebuilding her influence through her sons and carefully maintained correspondence networks. When she dies in 1509, it's of natural causes, in her own bed, having outlived Cesare Borgia by 6 years. He dies sick and abandoned in Spain. His empire collapsed. She dies having written letters of advice to the next generation of Italian noblewomen about how to survive in a world designed to crush them. The survival is the revenge, not dramatic, not cinematic just. The stubborn refusal to give her enemies the satisfaction of her destruction. But if Caterina's torment lasted months, Tamar of Georgia endured something that went on for years, and the worst part wasn't what her enemies did to her. It was what her own father allowed. The Caucasus, 1177, Tamar is 17 when she's crowned co-ruler of Georgia, the first woman to hold that title. Her father, King George III, is dying, and he's determined to secure her succession before his death. The Georgian nobility agree reluctantly because Tamar is brilliant, educated, politically astute, everything a monarch should be. Except one thing. She's unmarried, which means controllable, vulnerable, available. They choose a husband for her. His name is Yuri, a Russian prince with a military reputation and, as it turns out, a drinking problem so severe that even medieval chroniclers, who usually ignored such things, couldn't avoid documenting it. The marriage is a catastrophe from the first night. Yuri is violent, publicly abusive, and politically incompetent. Within months, he's turning the Georgian court into a spectacle of drunken rage. Tamar tries to manage it quietly, tries to maintain royal dignity while hiding bruises that servants later testified about in church records. 2 years into the marriage, she does something almost unheard of in medieval Christendom. She petitions the church for an annulment based on Yuri's cruelty. The church grants it. Yuri is sent back to Russia, and here's where you'd think the story ends Tamar free, resuming her rule moving forward. Except Yuri doesn't accept it. He comes back. Twice, leading armies, claiming he's been wronged, trying to reclaim what he sees as his stolen throne. Both times, Tamar has to lead her own forces against him. Imagine commanding troops to fight your ex-husband, who's literally invading your kingdom because you divorced him. The emotional and psychological toll is documented in letters Tamar wrote to her advisors' letters, where she talks about the nightmares, the constant fear that one day Yuri will succeed, that she'll be dragged back into that marriage, and everything she's built will collapse. She defeats him both times. The second time, Yuri disappears from historical records. Entirely historians speculate he was either killed by his own men or died in exile, abandoned by everyone who'd initially supported him. Tamar goes on to rule for another 30 years, overseeing what becomes known as Georgia's Golden Age. But the cost is recorded in medical accounts from her later life: chronic pain, difficulty sleeping, what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD. She survives. She rules brilliantly. She becomes Saint Tamar in the Georgian Orthodox Church. But survival doesn't mean the wounds close. It means you learn to carry them. Sometimes the atrocity isn't a single moment of violence. Sometimes it's the slow erasure of your humanity while everyone around you pretends it's normal. Juana of Castile, Juana la Loca, Mad Joanna's, perhaps the clearest example of this particular kind of torture. Because Juana wasn't mad. The historical records make that devastatingly clear. She was inconvenient. Spain, 1504, Juana inherits the throne of Castile when her mother, Isabella, dies. She should become one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Instead, her husband, Philip the Handsome, called that for his looks, not his character immediately, begins maneuvering to seize control. He spreads rumors about Juana's mental instability. He restricts her access to advisors. He has her correspondence monitored and intercepted. When Juana protests, when she tries to exercise her authority as queen, Philip has her confined to her chambers for her own well-being. Then Philip dies suddenly in 1506, possibly poisoned, possibly typhoid. The records are conveniently unclear. And Juana does something that history has used to justify her imprisonment for the next 46 years. She refuses to bury him immediately. She keeps his coffin with her, travels with it, occasionally opens it. To the world, this looks like madness. In context, it's strategy. The moment Philip is buried, Juana loses the only leverage she has. Her father, Ferdinand, is already preparing to declare her incompetent and take Castile for himself. The Castile nobles are circling, ready to marry her off to someone they can control. Philip's presence in his corpses, the only thing keeping them at bay, because while he's not buried, the succession remains technically unsettled. It doesn't work. Ferdinand has her declared insane and locks her in the fortress of Tordesillas. She's 27 years old. She will stay there until her death at 75. Nearly 5 decades in a fortress that becomes her prison, her tomb, her entire world. Letters smuggled out by sympathetic servants reveal that Juana remains lucid, politically aware, desperately trying to communicate with the outside world. Her son Charles V eventually becomes Holy Roman Emperor, partly through inheriting her throne she's still technically sitting on, even though she hasn't been allowed to rule it for decades. He visits her exactly once, and contemporary accounts describe her begging him to let her out, to let her participate in governance, to give her any role at all. He refuses. She's more useful to him as a living ghost, a queen who exists but doesn't interfere. When Juana finally dies in 1555, there's no state funeral, no period of mourning. She's buried quietly, almost secretly, as if the kingdom is embarrassed by how long she stayed alive. Her real crime wasn't madness. It was being a woman with a legitimate claim to power in a world where men had decided that was impossible. And her punishment wasn't executionate, was being forced to watch from a window as her entire life was stolen from her, year after year, with no end in sight except death. But some women didn't even get the isolation of a fortress. Some were put on display, their humiliation made public entertainment. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful women of the medieval period, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then Queen of England, mother to kings Richard and John. And for 16 years, her own husband kept her prisoner, moving her from castle to castle like a dangerous artifact that couldn't be destroyed but had to be contained. England, 1173. Eleanor makes a political calculation. She supports her son's rebellion against their father, King Henry II. It's not irrational. Henry has been openly flaunting his mistress, Rosamund Clifford, humiliating Eleanor publicly for years. The rebellion fails. Her sons are pardoned after negotiations. Eleanor is not. Henry has her arrested and begins a form of punishment that's designed to be worse than execution. He keeps her alive, but strips away every shred of autonomy, every connection to the power she once held. She's moved between fortified residences every few months, never allowed to stay anywhere long enough to build relationships with servants or guards. She's permitted no visitors without Henry's explicit approval. Letters she writes are read and often confiscated. She's given comfortable rooms, good food, fine clothes, all the trappings of queenship, except the one thing that matters: agency. It's a masterclass in psychological torture. She's not being punished for what she did. She's being erased, kept alive specifically so the world can see what happens to women who challenge their husband's authority. The cruelty is in the details. During her captivity, Henry parades his mistresses publicly, making sure Eleanor hears about it. When Rosamund Clifford dies possibly poisoned, the rumors said by Eleanor's supporters, though she was locked away at the time, Henry builds an elaborate tomb for her at Godstow Abbey, ensuring Eleanor knows even his mistress received more honor in death than she receives in life. Eleanor's sons are allowed to visit occasionally, but only under guard, and only for brief, supervised meetings where they can't discuss politics. She watches from windows as her world continues without her. Her Duchy of Aquitaine is managed by Henry's administrators. Her influence over England evaporates. She becomes a living ghost story, the dangerous queen locked away. But here's what Henry doesn't anticipate: Eleanor outlives him. In 1189, Henry dies, and Richard immediately releases his mother. She's 67 years old. Most women in that era were considered ancient by 50. Eleanor steps back into political life like she never left. She acts as regent when Richard goes on crusade. She personally travels across Europe to ransom Richard when he's captured. She lives to see John become king, and even in her 70s, she's riding across England, securing his succession. She dies at 82, having survived her husband by 15 years, having reclaimed every shred of power he tried to bury with her. The revenge is biological. She simply refuses to die when it would be convenient for the men who tried to erase her. Sometimes survival requires becoming someone unrecognizable. Isabella of France understood this better than most, and what she became to survive still makes historians uncomfortable. France, 1308. Isabella is 12 years old when she's married to Edward II of England. She's called the she-wolf of France by the end of her life, but when we first meet her, she's a child trying to fulfill an impossible role. Edward isn't interested in women his relationship with peers. Gaveston is so open that even medieval chroniclers, usually carefully vague about such things, document it explicitly. Isabella is publicly humiliated. At her own coronation, Edward gives Gaveston a position of honor that should have gone to her. Royal jewels intended for Isabella are given to Gaveston instead. She's treated not as a queen, but as a decorative inconvenience. She endures this for 17 years. She has 4 children with Edward duty fulfilled, at least biologically. But when Edward's new favorite, Hugh Despenser, becomes even more powerful than Gaveston was, something in Isabella breaks. Or perhaps doesn't break, perhaps hardens into something sharp and dangerous. Despenser isn't just Edward's lover. He's corrupt, seizing lands, imprisoning rivals, turning England into his personal treasury. And when Isabella tries to protest, when she attempts to use her position as queen to advocate for the nobility being crushed by Despenser's greed, Edward strips her of her lands and income. He takes her children away from her. He assigns guards to watch her constantly, not for protection, but for surveillance. In 1325, Isabella is sent to France on a diplomatic mission, a mistake Edward will regret for the rest of his very short remaining life. Once in France, Isabella refuses to return. She begins assembling an invasion force. She takes a lover, Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron with his own grudge against Despenser, and in 1326 she invades England with an army. It's not a large force, she doesn't need one. The English nobility hate Despenser so much that they flock to Isabella's side. Edward and Despenser flee. They're captured within weeks.